Lazarus raised from the dead. It was shortly after 12 o'clock when Martha received the message that Jesus was coming. She left her house at once and hurried to meet him. Her brother Lazarus had now been dead for 4 days, and his body had been placed in the family tomb. When Martha and Mary had sent word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus was very sick, they had high hopes that Jesus would do something about it. They knew Jesus very well and believed that he could heal any sickness. They believed that Jesus only needed to speak healing words to make Lazarus well again. But when Lazarus died, just a few hours after the messenger had left Bethany for Philadelphia, they concluded that this was because Jesus had only heard about the illness when it was already too late. But the message the courier brought back to Bethany on Tuesday morning puzzled them greatly. The messenger insisted that he had heard Jesus say, "This illness is not really unto death." They also did not understand why he had not sent them any message of sympathy or otherwise offered to help them. Lazarus and his sisters were children of a wealthy, prominent Jew who had been the leading resident of the village of Bethany. Their parents had died years ago, and they had inherited vineyards and olive groves. They were rich, and this is also evident from the fact that they had a private tomb on their own property. They were beloved citizens, and many people from the area and also from Jerusalem came to comfort the grieving sisters. Mary no longer believed that Jesus would come and had given herself over to her grief, but Martha clung to the hope that Jesus would still come. She had instructed a neighbor boy to keep an eye on the road to Jericho from the top of the hill, and this boy now brought the news that Jesus was on his way. Martha hurried to Jesus, and when she reached him, she fell at his feet and cried out, "Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus bent down and helped her up, and said, "Just believe, Martha, and your brother will rise again." Then Martha replied, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Then Jesus looked Martha straight in the eyes and said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. Truly, whoever lives and believes in me will never really die. Do you believe this?" And Martha answered the Master, "Yes, I believe that you are the Redeemer, the Son of the living God, he who was to come into this world." When Jesus asked about Mary, Martha hurried home and whispered to her sister, "The Master is here and has asked for you." When Mary heard this, she quickly got up and went out to Jesus, who was still standing at the same place where Martha had left him. When the people who were with Mary saw that she quickly got up and went out, they followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Some of those present were outspoken enemies of the new movement that emerged from Jesus. Therefore, Martha had whispered to Mary so that no one else could hear it. Martha sensed this tension and wanted to avoid any unpleasantness that might arise if Jesus were suddenly confronted by people who were openly hostile to him. It had been Martha's intention to stay with the guests in the house, while Mary would go to Jesus alone. But she did not succeed in this, for everyone followed Mary, and so they unexpectedly found themselves in the presence of Jesus. When Mary saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and cried out, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw the great sorrow, his soul was moved with compassion. The visitors, surprised to find Jesus here, respectfully stepped back a little, so that Martha and Mary could speak with Jesus alone. After taking some time to comfort Martha and Mary, Jesus asked them, "Where have you laid him?" Martha replied, "Come and see for yourself." And as Jesus walked with the two grieving sisters, he wept. When the guests who followed them saw his tears, one of them said, "See how much he loved him. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" They now stood before the family tomb, a small cave in a rock wall. We also are not entirely sure why Jesus wept. We are inclined to believe that Jesus wept because of a combination of thoughts and feelings that swirled through his consciousness. He truly shared in the sorrow of Martha and Mary. He had a deep, human affection for these sisters who had lost their brother. At that moment, he hesitated to bring Lazarus back to mortal life, for somewhere within himself, Jesus regretted calling his friend back to life. This was because he foresaw that Lazarus would face bitter persecution as a result of being the subject of the greatest manifestation of divine power that the Son of Man would perform in the flesh. The small group gathered before Lazarus' tomb had no awareness of the presence, nearby, of a large group of heavenly beings, led by the angel Gabriel. When Jesus spoke the commanding words, "Take away the stone," these assembled heavenly hosts prepared to perform the dramatic act of leading Lazarus' life spirit back into his mortal body. When Martha and Mary heard this command of Jesus, the order to roll away the stone from the tomb, they were filled with conflicting feelings. Mary hoped that Lazarus would be raised from the dead, but Martha was troubled because she knew that Lazarus' body was already decaying. Martha therefore said, "Should we roll away the stone? My brother has been dead for 4 days now. His body has already started to decay." But Jesus said, "Did I not tell you from the beginning that this illness would not result in death? I have come to fulfill my promise. If you believe, you will see the glory of God." When Jesus had finished speaking, his apostles took hold of the tombstone and rolled it away. And there stood 45 mortals in a semicircle around the open tomb. They could vaguely make out the figure of Lazarus, motionless, wrapped in linen cloths. While these earthly creatures stood there in almost breathless silence, an enormous host of heavenly beings had taken their places, ready to act when the signal was given. Jesus lifted his eyes and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear him. "Father, I thank you that you have heard and granted my request. I know that you always hear me, but for the sake of those standing here, I speak this way to you, so that they may believe that you have sent me into the world, and so that they may know that you are working with me in what we are about to do." And after he had prayed, he called out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The people around the tomb stood motionless, but the large group of heavenly servants moved in united activity, in obedience to the word of their Creator. It took only 12 seconds of earthly time before the lifeless form of Lazarus began to move and shortly thereafter sat up on the projecting edge of the stone ledge on which he had lain. His body was wrapped in grave clothes, and his face was covered with a towel. And when he stood before them, Jesus said, "Unbind him and let him go." All those present, except the apostles and Martha and Mary, fled. They were pale with fright and overwhelmed with astonishment. Lazarus greeted Jesus and the apostles, and asked what the grave clothes meant and why he had awakened in the tomb of his parents. Jesus and the apostles stepped aside, and Martha told Lazarus about his death, burial, and resurrection. She had to explain to him that he had died on Sunday and had now been brought back to life on Thursday, as he was not aware of the time that had passed since he had fallen into the sleep of death. Then Lazarus went to Jesus and knelt, along with his sisters, at the feet of Jesus to give thanks and praise God. Jesus took Lazarus by the hand, lifted him up, and said, "Son, What has happened to you will also be experienced by all who believe in the gospel of the kingdom. With this difference, they will be raised on another place and in a more glorious form. From now on, you are a living testimony to the truth that I have taught you here on earth. I am the resurrection and the life. But let us now go home, for you need food to strengthen you." Lazarus could hardly understand what had happened. He knew he had been very ill, but he could only remember falling asleep. He was never able to tell anything about those 4 days in the tomb. Time does not exist for those who are in the sleep of death. This event spread like wildfire through all Jerusalem. Dozens of men and women came to Bethany to see Lazarus and talk with him. Many temporarily believed in Jesus as a result of this mighty work, while others hardened their hearts to reject him all the more fiercely. The startled and distressed Pharisees hastily convened a meeting in the Sanhedrin to decide what should be done regarding these new developments. Lazarus remained in Bethany and became the focus of great interest from many sincere believers and numerous curious onlookers until the week of the crucifixion of Jesus. Then he was warned just in time that the Sanhedrin had ordered him to be put to death as well. For the Sanhedrin was determined to stop the spread of Jesus' teachings. They rightly judged that it would be useless to put Jesus to death if they allowed Lazarus, who represented the pinnacle of his miracles, to live and bear witness to the fact that Jesus had raised him from the dead. And so Lazarus hastily said goodbye to his sisters in Bethany and fled to Perea across the Jordan, not taking any long rest until he reached Philadelphia. Lazarus knew Abner and felt safe with him from the murderous schemes of the corrupt Sanhedrin. Shortly afterward, Martha and Mary sold their land in Bethany and followed their brother. Lazarus continued to testify about Jesus and later became the treasurer of the church in Philadelphia. He was a strong supporter of Abner in his dispute with Paul. He eventually died at the age of 67 of the same illness that had taken him to the grave in Bethany when he was much younger.